Your grandpa was never in the military, sweetheart. I don't know who told you that, but they lied to you. The voice belonged to Sergeant First Class Derek Holt, and it cut through the school gymnasium like a blade, sharp and bright and entirely sure of itself. He was 29 years old, 6'2", broad across the chest, in the way that made dress uniforms look tailored for statues, and he had come to Jefferson Middle School for the Army's Veterans Day Assembly program with the full expectation that the most challenging thing about the morning would be the parking. He stood with his arms loosely crossed in front of the small folding table where the students had been invited to speak with the assembled veterans. 3 men in total, none of whom wore their age as gracefully as this particular complication required. Beside Holt stood Corporal Yusuf Andrade, 24 and freshly returned from his second rotation, and Staff Sergeant Kelly Prentice, 31 and the only one who had noticed that something had gone badly wrong in the last 45 seconds. The girl standing across the table from Holt was 11 years old. Her name was Maya, according to the name tag she'd made in homeroom that morning, printed in careful block letters with a flower drawn beside it. She was small for her age, with dark braided hair and the kind of eyes that did not look away when they should have. She had approached the table after the formal presentation was over during the open Q&A portion, and she had said, in a perfectly clear and earnest voice, that her grandfather had served in the Special Forces during Vietnam, and that he had medals in a wooden box at home, and that she had always been proud of him and wanted to ask the soldiers what it felt like to earn a medal. Holt had made a mistake, and he had made it in front of 240 middle school students. 4 teachers, a vice principal named Mrs. Okafor, who was already moving from her chair by the bleachers, and 1 old man sitting in the second row of the bleachers seating who had not moved since Holt's words hit the air. "My grandpa doesn't lie," Maya said. Her voice was steady in the way that the voices of children are sometimes steady, with a kind of uncomplicated certainty that adults lose somewhere along the way. "He has a Purple Heart. He has 2 of them. And another one, a big one, that he says is the most important one." Holt's jaw worked briefly. He had not intended cruelty. He had heard the claim, cross-referenced it against a face in the bleachers, an old man in a flannel work shirt and faded canvas jacket, the kind of man who looked like he'd spent his life fixing other people's furnaces, and his brain had done what young, confident, institutionally powerful brains sometimes do. It had measured the visible evidence against the claim and found the claim improbable. Holt had 2 tours to his name and a combat infantryman badge and a habit of being the most decorated man in any room he entered, and he was not a cruel person. He was, however, 29 years old, and there are things you cannot know at 29 regardless of how much fire you have walked through. "I'm not saying your grandfather is a liar," he said, in the tone people use when they are in fact saying exactly that, just more gently. He unfolded his arms and gestured toward the bleachers. I'm not sure he may have told the whole story. A lot of people exaggerate their service. It happens. It doesn't make them bad people." A ripple moved through the assembled students, 240 11- and 12-year-olds, and every one of them understood what Holt had just done. Several of them looked at Maya. Several more looked at the bleachers. A few looked at the floor. Corporal Andrade leaned 3 inches toward Staff Sergeant Prentice and said, very quietly, "Sarge." Prentice was already watching the old man in the bleachers. He was 83 years old. His name was Earl Raymond Doss, and he was Maya's maternal grandfather, and he was sitting in the second row of bleacher seating with his hands resting on his knees in the particular way of a man who has long since made peace with patience. He wore the flannel shirt and the canvas jacket and a pair of worn work boots that had walked more earth than most people see in a lifetime. His face was deeply lined, the geography of 8 decades mapped across it in valleys and ridges, and his hair was white and close-cropped above ears that had stopped catching everything some years ago. But his eyes were something different. They were pale gray, and they were clear, and there was a quality in them that Prentice could not immediately name, a depth like looking through ice to the cold, dark water beneath. The kind of depth that did not amplify what it reflected, but simply absorbed it. He had not moved when Holt spoke. He had not flinched when the words landed. His hands remained perfectly still on his knees, hands that were mapworks of wrinkles and liver spots and the particular raised knuckling of a man who had worked with them his whole life, and yet they were utterly, unnervingly steady. Maya looked back at her grandfather. Earl Doss looked at his granddaughter for a moment, and then he looked at Sergeant First Class Derek Holt with those pale gray eyes, and he said, in a voice like gravel settling at the bottom of a very quiet river, "Come on up here, son." The gymnasium went very still. Holt hesitated. The hesitation lasted only a second, but a room full of 12-year-olds noticed it. Then he stepped around the folding table and walked toward the bleachers, because that was the thing to do, and because he was not, at his core, a coward, only a young man who had made an error and did not yet understand the magnitude of it. Earl Doss did not stand. He reached into the inner pocket of his canvas jacket and produced a small leather wallet, aged to the color of saddle leather, and from the wallet he removed a laminated card and held it out toward Holt without opening it. "DD214's at home," he said. "But my granddaughter didn't make anything up." Holt took the card. He looked at it. He read it once, and then he read it again, and some of the color that had been in his face began to migrate away from it. He handed the card back without a word. What Holt could not have said in that moment, and what was already eating quietly into the certainty he'd arrived with, was whether the card was real. He knew what it was. He had seen the identifier before, printed in a briefing document during his second deployment, in a paragraph about the classified history of a particular unit designation that most people in the room, most people in the Army, had only heard of in the way you hear of something legendary. Not as a fact, but as a story. Maya watched her grandfather put the wallet back in his jacket. She watched Holt's face. She was 11 years old, and she could read an adult's face the way most adults cannot read each other's, and what she saw in Holt's face was not the thing she had been looking for. It was not an apology. It was confusion, which was a different thing, and it would have to be enough for now. Holt walked back around the folding table. He was louder this time, with that particular loudness of a person who has felt uncertainty creep in and is trying to sound certain before anyone notices. "The thing about service records," he said, to the assembled students, to Mrs. Okafor, to the room, "is that they can be hard to verify. We respect everyone who served, but we also owe it to real veterans to make sure we're honoring, Sergeant." The word came from Staff Sergeant Prentice, and it was not loud, but it was the kind of word that stops things. Holt stopped. Prentice said, quietly, "I need to step out for a minute." She walked through the gymnasium's side exit into the hallway, and Corporal Andrade, who had spent the last 4 minutes watching the old man in the bleachers with the expression of someone trying very hard to place a face, fell into step behind her, because he could feel in his bones that she had seen something he had missed, and that she was about to do something that mattered. In the hallway, Prentice took out her phone. She was not a dramatic person. She had done 2 combat deployments, one of which had included 6 weeks embedded with a Special Operations Task Force, and during those 6 weeks she had heard a name mentioned 3 times in 3 very different contexts. Once by a colonel who had said it almost to himself, once in a briefing about the confirmed long-range record for a particular type of engagement, and once by a retired master sergeant at a bar in Fayetteville who had gone quiet when someone brought it up, and then said simply, "I knew him. I didn't know him." Nobody really knew him. She dialed the number for Fort Campbell's public affairs duty officer, because it was Veterans Day and it was the fastest line she could think of to the kind of person who would know. The duty officer answered on the second ring. Prentice said, "I need to reach someone in command who would know the name Earl Raymond Doss." DOSS served with the Studies and Observation Group, Vietnam era. The silence that followed lasted for 4 seconds. Prentice counted them. When the duty officer came back, his voice was entirely different, stripped of the professional neutrality he'd answered with, tight in a way that communicated urgency without saying so. "Can you confirm the name? Earl Raymond Doss?" "Yes. And your location?" "Jefferson Middle School, Clarksville. There's a Veterans Day assembly." A pause. Not long. The sound of movement on the other end, a chair, a door. "Staff Sergeant, I need you to do one thing for me. Do not let anyone else interact with that man. Don't touch him. Don't move him. I am making a call right now, and I need you to stay close. Can you do that?" Yes, the line did not go dead. It went to muffled urgency. The sound of another phone being picked up, a voice saying something she could not quite hear, and then the duty officer came back and said, 10 minutes. Possibly less. Prentice went back into the gymnasium. In the gymnasium, Holt had recovered his composure, or at least its appearance. He had moved the Q&A along to a different student, a boy named Terrence, who wanted to know about the difference between Army and Marine Corps training, and the room had mostly followed him there. Mostly, Mrs. Okafor was still watching the bleachers. Corporal Andrade was still watching the bleachers. And Maya had not returned to her seat in the student section, but had gone to sit beside her grandfather, and Earl Doss had put his arm around her without looking away from the room, and his pale gray eyes were patient and still. Prentice stood near the exit door and waited, and the weight of knowing what was coming settled into her chest like a stone. She was, she realized, the only person in the room who understood what was about to happen, and the old man in the bleachers, who had served in one of the most classified direct action units in American military history, who had been decorated with more combat valor in a 3-year period than most branches handed out in a decade, who had come to his granddaughter's school on a Tuesday morning in a flannel shirt and a canvas jacket that smelled of rain and wood smoke, because she had asked him to. He did not know help was on the way. He simply sat there and held his granddaughter and waited, the way a man waits when he has already waited for the hardest things. Holt was in the middle of explaining the difference between basic training and advanced individual training when he heard it. A siren. Faint at first, the way sirens are at distance, and then less faint, and then very clearly not distant at all. Several students looked up. Mrs. Okafor moved toward the main gymnasium doors. The siren was joined by a second, and then by the low, steady percussion of engines, multiple engines, moving fast, slowing in the way of vehicles that are parking with purpose. The gymnasium doors opened. Not the side doors, the main double doors, the ones at the far end of the room, the ones that led to the school's main entrance, the ones that Mrs. Okafor had been moving toward and now stopped moving toward because they had opened before she reached them. And what came through them was not one person. 3 vehicles had pulled up in front of Jefferson Middle School, 2 black government-plated SUVs and a military police cruiser, and the 9 people who came through the gymnasium doors came through them with the measured, quiet economy of motion of people who have spent their professional lives moving through spaces that required them to be exactly what they were. At the front was a woman in army service dress, with silver stars on her shoulders and close-cropped silver hair, and a bearing that made the gymnasium feel, suddenly and irrevocably, smaller. She was Major General Patricia Wren, and she did not look at Sergeant First Class Derek Holt. And she did not look at the folding table, and she did not look at Mrs. Okafor, or the 240 students, or the teachers, or the vice principal, or the school's American flag hanging from the ceiling on a braided cord. She looked at the bleachers. Her eyes found Earl Doss in the second row in approximately 1 second, the way eyes find things they have been waiting to find, and she walked toward him with the deliberate, measured steps of a person who is being very careful not to hurry. Her polished shoes on the gymnasium floor were the only sound in a room that had gone so still that the buzzing of the overhead lights became audible. She saw Holt. Her eyes moved to him for exactly long enough to take in the full picture. His position, his posture, what he had recently been doing, and then they moved back to Earl Doss, and they did not leave him again. She stopped at the bleachers, 2 feet from where he sat with his granddaughter. Holt's hand, which had been gesturing about something, came slowly down to his side. Earl Doss looked up at Major General Patricia Wren and said, in that gravel and patience voice, "Pat Earl," she said. And then, to the room, without preamble, "This man saved my brother's life in 1971. Pulled him out of a burning vehicle under fire 300 meters from the Cambodian border. My brother's name was David Wren. He died in 2019. Before he died, he told me that if I ever had the chance to stand in front of Earl Doss and salute him, I should not let that chance pass." The gymnasium was absolute silence. Major General Patricia Wren brought her right hand up in the sharpest, most breathtakingly precise salute that anyone in that room had ever seen, including Sergeant First Class Derek Holt, who had seen many salutes in his 7 years of service, and who would later struggle to describe what made this one different, except to say that it looked like something meant to be permanent. It was held 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, directed at an 83-year-old man in a flannel shirt and worn work boots sitting in the second row of a middle school gymnasium's bleachers, and in those 3 seconds something happened to the room that could not have been predicted and could not be adequately described. A collective breath was released. Several students who had been watching Maya with the particular cruelty that middle schoolers reserve for the exposed found that they could not look at her, not because of shame exactly, though there was shame, but because the reversal had been so complete and so sudden that looking required a reorientation they had not finished making. Maya looked at her grandfather. Earl Doss's pale gray eyes were soft in a way they had not been before. He returned the salute slowly, his steady hand rising to his temple, and then he lowered it. "You didn't have to make the trip, Pat," he said. "Corporal Trevino called the fort," she said, and nodded toward the duty officer who had accompanied her, a young man who looked like he was still adjusting to the speed at which the last 40 minutes had moved. "I was here in 20 minutes. The drive's 32. She turned to the room, to the students, and her voice did not soften, but it took on something that was not quite warmth, but was adjacent to it. "I'd like to tell you something about who this man is." She did not read from a document. She had not brought one. What she had instead was 53 years of service and a brother who had spent the last years of his life making sure she knew the story. And she told it the way soldiers tell the things that matter, without ornamentation, without inflation, with the kind of plain directness that makes facts land harder than any decoration would. Earl Raymond Doss had enlisted in the Army at 19. He had been selected for Special Forces at 21 and assigned to the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, Studies and Observation Group, MACSOG, an organization so classified that its existence had not been officially acknowledged for decades. He served 4 consecutive 12-month tours, refusing rotation, because the team he was on was the team he was on, and you did not leave your team. He had been awarded the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor Device, and 2 Purple Hearts. He had been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for an action in 1969 in which he held a defensive position alone for 40 minutes while his wounded team extracted, killing 11 enemy combatants and absorbing 3 rounds of fragmentary fire without leaving the position. And then she paused. And on the 3rd of March, 1971, she said, Earl Doss crossed back into the kill zone on a road 11 kilometers inside Cambodia, in the 3rd hour of an engagement that had already killed 2 of his teammates, and he pulled my 19-year-old brother out of a vehicle that was on fire. He was shot through the left shoulder doing it. He carried David Wren 200 meters to the extraction point. She looked at Earl Doss. He was put in for the Medal of Honor. The classification of the operation prevented the award from being made public for 26 years. She looked at the room. The medal in that wooden box that Maya's grandfather has at home, she said, is the Medal of Honor. The big one she couldn't name. That's what it is. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room completely, with no edges. Maya was looking at her grandfather with an expression that was not surprise. Exactly, it was more like recognition. The face of someone who had always known something was there and had now been given the word for it. The consequences for Holt came quietly and without drama, the way institutional consequences often do. Major General Wren spoke with him briefly in the hallway outside the gymnasium, with 2 of her staff present, and Mrs. Okafor close enough to hear, and Holt's face during that conversation moved through several expressions before settling into the one that would stay with him for the following months, which was the expression of a man who has understood something he cannot undo. There would be a formal counseling. There would be a mandatory session on something the Army called dignity and respect, which is a program that works better on some people than others, but which in Holt's case had the advantage of arriving at a moment when he was comprehensively unable to argue with the premise. His unit was notified. It was handled by the institution, firmly and without theater, because that is what institutions do. The gymnasium was settling back into itself, slowly, the way rooms do after something enormous has moved through them, when Earl Doss stood up from the bleachers. He moved carefully, but without evident difficulty, the move of a man who has learned which joints to trust and at what angles. He was not tall, and he was not large, and he looked exactly as he had looked when he came in, worn boots, flannel shirt, canvas jacket that smelled of rain and wood smoke. And he walked across the gymnasium floor toward the hallway where Holt had been taken. Holt was still there, standing in the kind of stillness that is not peace, but its absence. He looked up when the old man came through the doorway, and he had the expression of someone who has been waiting for something bad and has decided to meet it without flinching. That, at least, was a form of courage, even if it was a small one. Earl Doss stopped in front of him. He looked at Holt for a moment with those pale gray eyes, and then he reached out and put one steady, liver-spotted hand on Holt's left shoulder, the same shoulder he had been gesturing toward when he talked about the hero in the bleachers not deserving the benefit of the doubt. "You've got fire," he said. "That's not a small thing. Fire is what you need where you're going." Holt did not speak. He wasn't sure he could. But fire, without knowing what you're looking at, Earl Doss said, just burns the wrong things. He looked at Holt for one more moment with those patient, winter sky eyes. "The things worth knowing don't always announce themselves, son. You'll understand that more as you get older. The hope is you live long enough to use it." He took his hand off Holt's shoulder. He turned and went back into the gymnasium where his granddaughter was waiting. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning in February, when the cold had settled into Clarksville like a guest that had forgotten how to leave, there was a hardware store on Riverside Drive that smelled of machine oil and old wood and the particular warmth of a space fighting a losing battle against the outdoor temperature. Earl Doss was in the fasteners aisle, reading the label on a box of lag screws with his glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the expression of a man who has learned patience with small print. He heard the footsteps before he heard the voice, and he turned because he had spent enough years in places where turning at the sound of footsteps was the difference between going home and not, and the habit never fully leaves. Derek Holt was thinner. The institutional confidence had been somewhere, and the swagger that had come with the youth and the rank in the audience had been replaced by a posture that was more careful and considerably less large. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt not unlike the one Earl Doss was wearing, and he had the look of someone who had spent the last 3 months carrying something heavy and was still deciding whether to put it down. "I wanted to find you," he said. "I wasn't sure I should, but I wanted to." Earl Doss looked at him for a moment. "You found me," he said. "I'm sorry," Holt said, "for what I said. To your granddaughter. To you." He paused. I didn't understand what I was looking at." Earl Doss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, you didn't." He turned and picked up the box of lag screws. "You hungry?" Holt blinked. "Sir, there's a diner on Craft," Earl Doss said. "Best coffee in Clarksville. Might as well have coffee." He walked toward the end of the aisle, and after a moment Holt followed him, because there was nothing else to do, and because it was the kind of offer you do not refuse when it is made by a man who has seen what he has seen and still chooses to make it. The quiet heroes are there, in the hardware stores and the diners and the school gymnasiums on Tuesday mornings, in the flannel shirts and the worn work boots, carrying things no one can see. Most of the time, no one thinks to ask. This time, a girl with braided hair and a flower on her name tag asked, because she already knew. If you were moved by Earl's story of quiet courage and timeless wisdom, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes.